got very interested in olive oil. I had been to an olive oil tasting at the end of the 1980s, given by an extraordinary Spanish woman called Alicia Rios, who still writes on food in Spain. I went to an olive oil tasting that she gave where we tasted 6 Spanish olive oils, and I couldn't believe how differently they tasted, and I wanted to find out why they tasted so different. So I went up to see Heidi Lassells, who was running Books for Cooks at that time in Notting Hill, and said, I want a book on olive oil. And she said, well, there isn't one. And I said, well, come on, Heidi, you've got 2,000 books here. You've got to have a book on olive oil. She said, no, there isn't one. Why don't you go away and write it? And when I met John and I realised they were doing cookery, I happened to mention to him that I fancied doing a book on olive oil. So he said, okay, do a proposal, send it in to us. So I did. I sent it in and they turned it down because they'd just been offered a book by somebody else on oils and vinegars. So because I'd been in sales in publishing all my life, I phoned up John and I said, no, you've got this all wrong. Oil and vinegar have nothing in common other than mixing it together for vinaigrette. You really should just be doing a book on olive oil. So I went in and I pitched my proposal again to John and his partner, Roger. And they accepted my book and turned the other one down. So basically at that point, Roger was wanting to move on and do other things because John wanted to get much more into publishing than packaging. So we bought Roger out and set Grub Street up together really solely as a publishing company. I think that the benefits of being an independent as opposed to being somebody, I mean, I could not work in a corporate environment. I wouldn't last 5 minutes. I'd be unemployable. I mean, the beauty is being able to do what you want to do. We publish from the heart. You know, if we take on a project, we haven't got to sit round a table with the marketing department and the accountants and everybody else saying, oh, no, you can't do this. I mean, it's our money that's going on the line. You know, we publish if we have a gut feeling. That kind of gut feeling is very difficult to do, I think, if you're in the corporate world of publishing. The thing again about being independent is you're often ahead of the curve, and we've often done books that have ostensibly first time around failed, and then we've had to wait for everybody else to catch up with us. I mean, olive oil was one of those examples. I mean, my olive oil book, which actually Grub Street packaged, it didn't publish. It was sold to Macmillan. The real transformation which has made life infinitely easier for the independent is online sales. And we've seen, of course, the next stage from that now is the huge growth of self-published authors who are saying, look, I don't even need a publisher, I can do all this myself. So I think the pleasures are, you know, it's your own game, you can do what you want to do. That at times brings huge stresses and strains. I mean, our distributor 10 years ago went out of business owing us £150,000, which amazingly and miraculously we survived, but there were times when we thought we wouldn't. So it can be nerve-wracking. But it's the pleasure of being able to do a book, hold it up and go, you know, I did that, and I'm not answerable to anybody else. My publishing background, I worked for literary publishers before I set up on my own. I started my publishing career at Faber. I'd read English at university. And when I got my first job at Faber, I thought I'd died and gone to heaven because I was meeting people I'd read at university. I met Seamus Heaney, I met Samuel Beckett, I met Alan Bennett, I met Ted Hughes, I met all these people. And it's writing that's the important thing to me. And that kind of passion for literary fiction and things literary is what certainly drew me in my interest in food, which I think started as a teenager. I mean, I remember, I've still got them. I collected Jane Grigson's part were weekend supplements in the colour magazine. I've still got all those, all crispy and crunchy. And so it was Jane Grigson, and then Elizabeth David, and then Robert Carrier, and people like that who drew me to food. And so those were the days when there were hardly any photographs in books. You were reading the word, and in the case of somebody like Jane Grigson, it was like having a really good friend standing beside you in the kitchen. And so those are the kind of books that attract me now, even now, to commission. That's why I've done books. I mean, we published Michael Bateman, and I knew Michael very well for years before he died, and used to read him in the Sunday Times, and then latterly in the Independent. And again, he was one of those writers who changed the way. I mean, Michael was asking, you know, in the 70s, do you know where your chicken comes from and how it was raised? Well, nobody was asking questions like that in those days. So we did a collection of his writings, and I am drawn to people who, you know, who do have a voice. I mean, another author who sadly didn't sell at all well, but I loved her writing, was Sarah Freeman, who wrote a lot about British food. And when I have first-time authors, of which I do have a lot because I like to take on and nurture new talent, I often used to give a copy of Sarah's book to them and say, when I'm trying to explain to them how to find their voice, because that is to me what it's about. I don't publish like Dorling Kindersley, where you have a photograph and a caption and everything has to fit into so many words. Authors often come to me and say, well, how many words have I got? And I go, write, just write. You know, we'll cut it if necessary, but just write. And then if I can see they're struggling to find a voice, then I'll give them a book like Sarah's and say, look, this is how you build a voice. This is a voice. And they read it and they get it, because it is that. Having somebody, the instructions, which I don't think ought to be necessarily like, Haynes' car manual. I mean, you can do recipes like that, but it's nice to get the personality of the person who's writing about it to you. And so that does mean different voices, but I think it should be that, I would say, never leave your reader standing in the kitchen thinking, what the hell do I do now? No. So I'm not interested in doing books that publish to a formula, which is often why I will only publish one book by somebody, because often what I'm looking for is somebody who has an absolutely overarching passion about one subject, and that's the only thing they'll ever write on. And that's fine with me, because I want people who are passionate. It's like I have this wonderful author, Robin Weir, who's basically the kind of world's authority on ice cream. There is nothing that Robin doesn't know about ice cream. He collects ephemera, he does everything. He's never going to do another book, ice cream. He's a very, very successful businessman, running his own business, but his passion is ice cream. A lot of people come to us. I go out looking for people. I mean, I do buy books from overseas as well, and translate. We've translated books from French, from Danish, from Spanish. I go to the States to trawl around amongst smaller publishers. You know, in any year I might have 2 or 3 or 4, depending on what's available, American books, because I've always loved the way American food writers write about, especially vegetarian cooking. They celebrate it. I mean, obviously Alice Waters wasn't particularly vegetarian, but that kind of celebration of natural ingredients is something that I think especially West Coast American writers have a particular penchant for. I think there's a tendency in England, still even now a bit, to be kind of brown rice and knitted yoghurt, a bit worthy on the vegetarian kind of front. What is the future of cookbooks? I can't ever see them disappearing. I mean, we're moving into, to use that well-known phrase at the moment, a multi-platform environment. But, you know, when ebooks first started coming out, and obviously that, you know, those really out of the starting blocks, not surprisingly, have been fiction, and really and truly that's where most of the sales still lie. This talk endlessly about how everything is moving to ebook is not really the case in the non-fiction world. It is maybe biography and history, but fiction is mostly where it's at. So when ebooks started emerging on the scene, I mean, I love the new technology. I think it's so exciting. What's exciting for me as a publisher is able to reach out to my readers, you know, people who tweet, follow us on Twitter, people who you know, can contact us now in a way never before. The kind of people who love Grub Street books are those people who will say, oh, I sit in bed and read cookbooks like I read a novel. And the overwhelming response from most of them was, I love being able to flick through a book. Obviously, the whole thing, I think, is if you're into food, you are into a certain amount of aesthetic and sensuality. And there is something about a physical book. I mean, what drew me into publishing or being a book collector as a child was often just the physicality of the book. It was the smell of the paper, it was the design, it was the feel of it. I still feel that now about books. I really care about how we craft the books that we do, the ink on paper. And an awful lot of avid, you know, cookbook collectors say, but I love seeing all that smeary history of my cooking through that book. You know, there's a dollop of tomato sauce on one page and there's some old bits of parsley sort of wedged between others. I can also, you know, scribble in the margin, you know, not enough chili powder, too much lemon juice, all of this kind of thing. I think a lot of people buy cookbooks these days as a bit of a lifestyle statement. I mean, every restaurant now wants to have a cookbook, and it's like been there, done it, haven't bought the t-shirt, got the cookbook. And in fact, I can remember many years ago when in fact the River Cafe were about the first of the restaurants who brought out their cookbook, sitting and waiting for somebody for lunch. And while I was sitting there, the waiter came up to me and said, would you like to read our cookbook while you're waiting? And I thought, what a brilliant sales technique. So there's the, you know, I've eaten at the restaurant, I want the recipes, though it's quite beyond me why anybody wants to recreate restaurant recipes. I love eating out. It's what I do, you know. I'd almost put professional eater in my passport. But if I go and I eat somewhere, especially, you know, Michelin-starred restaurant with incredible, I don't want to try and do that at home. But what I think is interesting, and this is where the huge changes come, there are people out there now who do want to do that, and I am constantly in awe, especially when I watch something like MasterChef, and you've got these 20-somethings who, they're not just gifted amateur, which is what I would describe. You know, I can do a really great roast chicken, and I can, you know, do really good stews, and I can do other things, but I can't cook like they can. I have to say, the one thing drives me insane these days with comments on Amazon are people who will write about one of our books and say how much they absolutely adored our book, how they thought it was one of the best cookbooks, the recipes were fantastic, the recipes worked, but there weren't enough pictures, so they give us a 4-star review, or there aren't any pictures at all, so they give us a 4 or a 3-star review. And I just think, you bought the book, you've said the recipes work, you know, what more do you want? But I do think that too many people try and put cookery books into a one-size-fits-all. So this is what I meant about how it's been fantastic with online selling, because years ago, before we had online sales, I would go and I would present our cookbooks to buyers who were the gatekeepers for the chains when we had chains. And if the buyer didn't like the book and they said they weren't going to stock it, that was it, end of story. There was no route to market. And I would be faced mostly by very young buyers who had been brought up in a culture of only ever having cookbooks with lots of colour. So they'd look at my books and they'd go, there hasn't got any pictures. And I go, no. And they go, but cookbooks without colour don't sell. And it still drives me insane when people say that, because I think there are different, it is not just one amorphous mass of a market. There are people who never want to have pictures and say so because they feel threatened by it. People who are always going to want pictures because they feel too nervous otherwise. And lots of gradations in between. And if only people would recognise, that there are horses for courses, we could all, coexist quite happily. There's no question that the person, if I could pluck them where they are tomorrow and have them, is Nigel Slater. I was asked to do a kind of like day in the life of, and I wrote about, what I was doing that week, editing this, commissioning that, doing this, blah, 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 blah. And it had been one of those weeks, I think, where I'd been and done a presentation to a buyer, and the buyer had said, oh, but I haven't got any colour pictures in it, don't want it. And it was when Nigel's first book came out, and his didn't have any colour pictures in it, and I bought a copy. I must have been following him, because I think he was writing Marie Claire in those days. Anyway, I bought the book, and I thought, oh God, this, as so many people have said, and I think this is why so many people do love him, it was how I've always cooked, pretty much to the market, in season, simple, pleasurable food. So I wrote in my piece, everybody goes on about, cookbooks without colour don't make people want to cook. I said, I've just bought a book by a new author, Nigel Slater, and I can't think of anybody who has sent me rushing to the kitchen quicker to want to cook. And out of the blue came a postcard from Nigel. He'd read this piece I'd written in the Guild newsletter, saying, thank you so much, I'm so pleased that, my book's given you pleasure, blah, 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 blah. And that was great. And then when his next book came out, which was Real Fast Puddings, he sent me a complimentary signed copy saying, you might be happy to have this to go along with your copy of Real Fast Food. So Nigel never fails to inspire, I think, and it's that gentle, kind of relaxed that I've always really liked. Just before she died, sadly, last year, I was looking at redoing Katie Stewart's book and was in exchanges with her about that, the complications of the copyright, because it's the Times book. Katie would have been lovely, I think, to work with. Again, one of those kind of very competent, knowledgeable, but wearing her knowledge lightly, which is what I always thought. Well, I suppose if I'm going to go down that route and say who would I have loved, Jane Grigson would have been, because I met Jane quite a number of times, and she was that incredibly generous, giving, which is what I think. I think that's why I like publishing food writers, by and large, with fairly few exceptions. People who are into food are giving people. It's about breaking bread and sitting down at a table and sharing things with people. When I get asked what my favourite book is, I'm never really sure that I have a favourite, because I have so many different moods when it comes to food. I tend to go into a particular mode when I'm working with an author. So we've been eating nothing but dal at home recently. And then a while ago when I was doing a Japanese book, it was all Japanese food. One book. I don't think I could limit myself down to one book. I'm going to be really naughty here and say Cast Away on a Desert Island with only one book to take with me. It is actually one of my own, but it's a classic reissue, and it's Margaret Costa's Four Seasons cookery book. That was the very, very first classic reissue that we did. And, whenever I go to that book, when I need something, there's something there. I just never tire of that book. So that's probably, it's a Grub Street book, but that's the one that I'm pleased. And Cast Away on a Desert Island, that's what I take with me.